It's live. Mhm.
Song. That's a good song to keep you from getting in the doldrums. No, God's still in control. This is my Father's world. You know, you get there's too many things to get discouraged about, but this is my Father's world. No matter what. Here it says, that though the wrong seems off so strong, God is the ruler yet. Yeah. And I also like the part where it talks about in the rustling grass, I hear him pass. Can you imagine that? Taking a walk with the Lord beside you. Well, today we want to continue this afternoon with where we have been going. We've looked at Ellen White's life in general and how her call to ministry. The second portion, we looked at some of the blessings, her practical blessings that we've seen in her writings. And now we're going into the sketchy part. Okay, this is where people have made accusations, and we're going to deal with some of them, but doing so, taking the high road, looking at these things in a sense of, as she put it this way, she talked about how that Jesus met his opponents. And that, you can take somebody tit for tat, point for point, and go down the road, and most people can't even follow you, and so you lose out. And Jesus didn't take them on point for point. He taught them the truth and left it to them to figure out what wasn't right. That's what we want to do, is to build the case for the strength of it, and not to be harsh in any way. Okay. So why the opponents of Ellen G. White get it wrong? I was introduced to this subject a while back, and or not introduced because I've done it for a number of years, but I was invited to participate with a particular channel on YouTube that is known for being anti-Adventist. And I had watched a number of his presentations, and I had virtually vowed that I would never really consider going on a program with him because of his manner. I felt like he's not going to give me a fair shake. He wouldn't listen. And so why should I subject myself to that? But we got in touch with one another after I went on a program with another guy. There's a guy down in Australia who has his program. And I heard something in his presentation that was different. You know, Ellen White spent a lot of time down in Australia.
Yes.
You know, she almost stayed there.
Yeah.
She loved it so much. The people there loved her so much. She had such a beautiful time there. And when she left, they wrote notes, and there's a little book that tells about it. So they were going to miss her so badly. While she was there, this is what the fellow was talking about. He lived up the street in Wollongong from the house that she lived in. It's set up as kind of a museum there, and people can go and read materials and kind of like a little museum. And the college is also there. He happens to no longer be an Adventist. But he was talking about Ellen White, and he said, it kind of puzzles me because his mom is a local historian, Adventist, but also of the culture of that community. And he said, she brought me these articles where people would talk about Ellen White and the things that she did for them in the community. Somebody had a need, and she made sure that somebody had some money to help them fix a fence or to repair something, or there was a deficiency of jobs at that time. It was a depression in Australia. And so she would step in practical ways to help people and to help the work. Give you one story that took place. Ellen White suffered with arthritis for a number of years. And when she first went to Australia, the environment was really harsh on her. You know, they have their winters and summers, the reverse of ours. And she got there when it was cold and she was miserable. Rheumatoid arthritis, you know. And so for the first year that she was there, she barely could write at all because of so much pain that she was going through. As she put it in a positive light, it was that experience that helped her to appreciate the sufferings of our Lord. But somebody heard about it, and that for her to even write once she got to a better place, they had to put her in a chair and prop up her arms in a certain way so that it didn't put weight on her shoulders, and so that she could write, and she'd write, and write she did, lots. But it was this kind of awkward thing with her chair. So somebody, a very kind person, donated this excellent chair for her comfort. She sold it. And the kids stuck with what she had so that they could take the money and help a new church that was getting started. That's not a one-off in her experience. So knowing these kinds of stories, this fellow, Peter Dixon is his name, said, I don't know what to do with that because, you know, here are these criticisms that we hear and these scholars who are presenting these flaws about her character, you know, that she was conniving and controlling and all these things that they said. I've got these two different pictures of her. I don't know exactly what to do. And I said, I know what to do. I'll come on your program and we'll talk about it. So I did. And we had a very congenial conversation about that. He still bought into some of the ideas that people had presented about her on the other side. I didn't get a chance to present all of that. But there was this wonderful spirit, you know, in our conversation. And that caught the attention of this other fellow who was running this other program. And I won't, well, you know, anybody that's been watching these things knows who it is. But anyway, he invited me on, and I said, look, he wanted a debate between me and a former Adventist by the name of Steve Daly. And Steve has written a couple of books and used to be out in La Sierra, and he was, he was a pastor, and so he has some credibility because he was an Adventist pastor, right? He should know. So he wanted me to do a debate. I said, I don't like the idea of debates because, debates don't necessarily bring you to the truth. They elucidate the debating ability of the two parties, and sometimes truth gets lost. And sometimes you get more heat than you get light. So I really don't really want to do a debate. He said, and furthermore, I believe if I have a difference with somebody, that I should go to that person first and express that idea so that if they want to make corrections, they can privately. Now, I've had the experience of publishing something publicly and then getting feedback that embarrassed the socks off of me. I wish that somebody had told me about it before I had gone public, right? So I like that. I want to give that, extend that to others. And so I have not spoken with Steve Daly yet. And I tried. Apparently I used the wrong channels. He said, well, you just did this. I said, yeah, now I know. But I never could really discuss it with him. He said, I want to invite you on the program to discuss these subjects. I said, okay, well, that sounds okay. So after I'd done some videos on it. Those of you who have seen my channel have seen some of the videos I did in response to specific points. And he took those specific points and made it into the subject matter we were supposed to discuss. I came on the program and he said, okay, opening statements will be 5 minutes. You'll have a chance to rebut. And I said,
That's easy. That's not a discussion.
this sounds like a debate. And it was. It was. And my friends told me that I did a better job. And his friends said that he did a better job. So, I think it pretty much split things down the middle. But what I did discover in the process was that he was relying on the opinions of other scholars to do his thinking for him. And he would cite them, and when I would go into the granularity, the specifics of it, can't even say the word, and he didn't know what to do with it because he had not studied it out himself. And so in those cases, he looked unprepared. And when he made simple statements of apparent fact, which are opinions, which I had to explain with 2 or 3 things to be able to explain the context, he looked better because what he said was simpler. And so that was the upshot of that experience. So I don't like debates, but I do like to share the truth. And I do think that there are people that are asking these questions and do so with some sincerity, and others with mixed motivations. We all have different motivations. Well, I didn't recognize the Ellen White that he was describing. I didn't recognize it. I don't know if you've ever met somebody or heard somebody on TV describing somebody that you think you know, and they have a whole different slant. You say, how in the world did they get it there? So we all have different glasses, even if you're not wearing glasses. We look at things through different lenses. Some things we look at negatively from the start, and so you're not going to see positive. Some people have rosy colored glasses. I tend to be an optimist as much as I can. So I cut people slack. I give them the benefit of the doubt. God's a better judge than I am. All right, we missed a video at the beginning, so we're going to do that now. All right, and you guys will get to see what we're talking about, the power of Ellen White's prayers. I think this is really, really interesting. And this is from an eyewitness. And I just captured it and put it together here for you to be able to see. All right, so let's give HMS Richards Sr. our attention.
Yes, I knew such a wife in this way. I heard her preach once and saw her, of course. It was in Boulder, Colorado, at the camp meeting in 1909. In the building with an iron roof right at the base of the Red Rocks there, on the campus of the University of Colorado. And he was there, I suppose there were 200 Adventists, maybe the rest of 1,000 people or 800 people were just people of the town, people of various denominations, wanted to see the Adventist crown. I can remember when she came on the grounds in a surrey drawn by 2 horses, and Willie Hyde, her son, was with her, and Miss McIntyre, her companion and nurse. And leaving that night, she preached to us. I was sitting at her left hand, about 15 feet from her. Could see her plainly, of course, right there. Platform was about a foot and a half high. And she had this big, thick Bible. She was preaching faithfully, giving God's message. And I was interested. It was interesting. She was just a dear, sweet Christian mother or grandmother telling us what we ought to do. Just as she started to talk to finish off, it started to rain on that iron roof, and you can imagine. Now remember, no amplifiers in those days, except you carried your amplifier with you. And she had a regular preaching voice, and you know, from this conversational tone or voice that she'd been using, she went into her real preaching voice. And you could hear her voice just like a silver bell right through all that confusion caused by that rain. She could talk right through the rain noise. And then she talked just about a minute. And then she kneeled down to pray. She told her son how to pray for us. As he came over on my side of the platform and kneeled down and prayed. I can hear her now. She said, not our Father, but oh, my Father. And from that moment on, the personal communion between her and the Heavenly Father. In just a minute or two, there seemed to be a mighty power over that meeting. I felt it out as a boy. I was a member of the church. I'd been baptized about a year and a half before. And I could feel that power. So finally, I was afraid to look up for fear I'd see God standing right there. But she was talking again. She'd forgotten all about us. And she was in the presence of the Lord. And a minute or two more went by, and that whole, you could hear them weeping, crying over their sin. A tremendous revival, really. Spiritual revival, the mighty power of God. When she preached, God blessed her as a preacher. But when she began to pray, he honored her as his prophet before the people. I'll never forget it.
When she prayed. Yeah. So, this is on one of the websites. And somebody asked me, is that really a picture of Ellen White? And I said, I was faintly familiar. And somebody uses this kind of as a logo whenever they talk about Adventists. This is it. And, you know, it looks a little sinister, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, those deep, dark eyes. You know, it's like she was trying to audition for a part in a scary movie or something, you know? I looked up the original picture. Subtle, but do you see there's kind of a pleasant look on her face?
Right.
Yeah. So I started thinking that, you know, even in you know, they'll say, well, that's her very picture, that's her very image. And sometimes they'll say, those are her very words. But if you just slant it just a little bit, it looks something a little different, doesn't it? And by the way, this is the original image where it came from. So it was just cut out of that. She just sitting there. And I noticed that a lot of these pictures, ever since she was in Australia, she had all of her teeth extracted. She had false teeth entirely. And you know that how that kind of changes how your face looks. So the rest of the pictures that I saw of her, her mouth has that same expression. I think it's the dentures. It's the dentures. And most photos that are of her, if they're taken in that era, you didn't smile in those days in pictures. Have you noticed that a lot of those pictures from the old days, they didn't? You know why that is? Because if you smile, your muscles fatigue after a while, and you get a blur in the image. So if your resting face, you know, what do they call that? Ugly resting face or something like that. Some people have it. But you know, if you're just resting your face as it normally is, it doesn't look so pleasant. But that's the way I like these pictures look. I think it's a little bit, it gives us some idea about, you know, just a picture, how that people can see things differently, and then all they can do is pass along. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed it, but in that first picture, it had a different logo or website on the bottom. They were the ones who supplied the image. So should it be any surprise to us when one critic passes their knowledge or their appraisal of Ellen White to another critic who passes their appraisal? So all you got is one person passing it to another, and then they live in their own little bubble, and they all think they're right. And then when you challenge it, they attack you personally. Or accuse you of poor scholarship, in my case, reason. And I have to respond and say, I will avoid the personal issues and just share with you the facts, the evidence. I can't make anybody believe, but I can share what has been acknowledged to me and what I have discovered. So as a writer, this is one of the key issues that we'll be dealing with. As a writer, is it legitimate for an inspired writer to use the tools available to other writers? What do you think? Is it legitimate? Okay. Now, a lot of the attacks on her are addressing the issue that an inspired writer wouldn't do it that way. Whatever notion that they have of what an inspired writer would do, she's judged on the basis of that assumption. An inspired writer wouldn't do it that way. I had a discussion, the same fellow that Peter Dixon that I talked to, I popped in on another video, and he always has given me respect. I appreciate that. He's always given me respect. And I popped in when he was talking with another researcher. He interviews lots of different people, and mostly on the fringes of Adventism, sometimes people that are, well-known people within the church. And you'll get some of them on here too. But this particular subject guy, it was something I was knowledgeable about, and they treated me with respect when I responded to him. And so I asked the question, if she weren't an inspired writer, would it be wrong for her to adapt phrasing from another author? Would you consider that illegitimate? And they both said, no. People do that. Preachers do that. Yeah. You hear something nice from somebody says it a nice way. Hey, I'm gonna put that in my sermon, man. That's gonna hit it, And so we preachers are a bunch of thieves when it comes to people's words. And your only justification is if you steal a lot. You got to get from different sources. But it's because why? Who cares where it came from? If it's the truth. Because in preaching, You don't get the footnotes unless you're calling somebody to a Bible verse or a quotation that's a particular quotation. You're preaching it. And if it preaches well, you preach it. So it isn't a matter of whether it's legitimate for other writers. The question is about an inspired writer, and that has to do with the way we think about inspiration. So we ask that question, is it legitimate for an inspired writer to use the tools of others? It's almost like they paint an inspired writer, one who gets vision, to say, it's only fair for you to use visions. Anybody else could do research. Anybody else could adapt wording from anybody else. Anybody else could do any of that, but because you're inspired, you can only say what God told you to say in a very rigid way. But is that what we find in the Bible? Well, we got some folks here who've seen some of my videos, so this will be good repetition of some of that. But we're going to take a look at some of the Bible writers and how they wrote. For example, John, book of Revelation. Like him, she wrote out what God gave her in panoramic vision. Okay? What did God say to John? What thou seest, write in a book. He didn't say, John, take dictation. Okay. See, some people think that inspiration means taking dictation. That God gives you the, kind of like these spiritualists who put their hands on the typewriter and, write up a story. But God doesn't work that way. God works through the person's mind. And so for John, he showed him pictures, and John described it in exquisite detail, but the best that he could. Now, when I took the book of Revelation, studies in Revelation in school, they told me that there are mistakes in the Greek in the book of Revelation. I don't know whether that's true or not. Might be that in one region they say it one way, and in another region they say it another. But it wasn't like his Greek in John, in the book of John. So they postulated that John wrote on Patmos without the benefit of a proofreader like he might have had when he was back home writing the Gospel of John. Do we lose anything in that? If I say he don't do it right instead of he doesn't do it right, are you not going to understand me? Ellen White said one time, until you know the Word of God, don't you never quote Sister White. That was her actual word. They took it down. Sometimes she used poor grammar. I've looked at her original writings. Ron Graybill, for some of you know the name Ron Graybill? He used to work with the White Estate for a while. He and I have gone through some of her handwriting manuscripts and transcribed it out. These are things that have already been published in polished form. But you see little mistakes. She doesn't capitalize everything. Sometimes when she's writing really fast, she doesn't put in all the periods and commas and stuff. Why? Because when they copy it, they're going to fix that. Does that make a person less inspired because they don't say everything perfectly? In fact, if God had to pick the people that had the best elocution, we'd be sunk. Because some of the people with the best elocution don't know nothing about spiritual things. Anyway, so John was shown pictures. He saw these panoramic views, and he was left to describe it. And he used different ways. If you studied into the background of it, I think you mentioned this in your presentation, that he used some wording from extra biblical as well as biblical. What's the big deal? She said, and look over here, I am as dependent upon the Spirit of the Lord in writing my views as I am in receiving them, yet the words I employ in describing what I have seen are my own, my choice. My choice. Now, does it mean that it all comes from her vocabulary? No. We're going to see a little bit about that. Because sometimes she would find somebody who'd written it best, and she would take it. Sometimes it wasn't theologically correct, and she'd fix that. Sometimes it was a little wordy. Oh, a lot of times it was wordy because the people that wrote back in those days, they wrote long sentences, long sentences. She'd shorten it up, she'd tighten it up. Sometimes she would change one word or another to make it more precise. I can give you some examples of that. Don't have them on the slides, but examples like that. So she would find a gem of truth in one setting, take it, cut it, polish it, reset it in another place so that it could make that presentation sparkle. Now, some people, the critics in mind, this is where they get it wrong. They think that what she did was she just grabbed books off her shelf and just took it and put it together from all those books. But they haven't stopped to analyze what she takes and what she doesn't, how she adapts, how it fits in with what she's saying. And if you took that gem of thought out that actually just made it sparkle, if you took it out of the presentation, you'd still have the same presentation, just minus that sparkle. They haven't looked at that. So, legitimately, she chose the words. Who else we can compare to? Well, Solomon. I think you mentioned this one too. Yeah. Solomon. He gathered gems of truth and fit words from many sources. That's what he tells us in Ecclesiastes. All right. The teacher searched out and set in order many proverbs, those are thought gems, and searched to find just the right words. And what does she do? Truths have been dug out and presented to the people as precious pearls of priceless value. Same thing. But God wouldn't do it that way. Oh, so you're going to find fault with John and Solomon, huh? Okay. What about Luke? You know, we speak of the Gospels as eyewitnesses of the life of Christ, but, you know, Luke was not an eyewitness of the life of Christ. He came on board afterwards. So his Gospel is a little different. Luke in his Gospel adapted the accounts and words of earlier authors. It has been estimated, I think it's more of an estimate than a calculation, but Mark's Gospel, 91% of Mark's Gospel has been used in Matthew and Luke's Gospels. John's another thing. 91%. I say it's cannibalized, but it's in a good way, you know. Because you read Matthew, he's got one emphasis. Luke has a different emphasis, and Mark is a different one. But same facts, same stories, some details a little different. I'm preaching through the life of Christ in my church right now, have been for about 80-some weeks. And it's called They Saw Him. It's the whole series. And so there's a richness in looking at the different stories of the life of Christ and trying to understand who was the one that saw it and who said what. And then when you compare multiple versions, you get new nuances and meaning that you don't get otherwise. I recommend, if you don't have one, get a harmony of the Gospels where it lays it down side by side. So you can look at the life of Christ in its full richness. I think it's a great thing. Luke, in his Gospel, adapted the writings of others. I did too. Yeah, here he says it. It seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in an orderly sequence. Luke was a researcher. What about Ellen White? In some cases where a historian has so grouped together events as to afford in brief a comprehensive view of the subjects or has summarized details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted in some instances, but other times adapted, concentrated to tell the story. Paul gained some of his information from common sources as well as divine revelation. Not everything that he wrote out in his epistles was something that was given to him in a dream or a vision. He received word, and so he responded to those things. And sometimes he said, I think I'm inspired in this. He wasn't even quite sure about his advice. But he can do that, as we find here. Oops, this side. For it has been reported to me, he says. And she says, I learned that the meeting in the tent last night was excellent and the attendance large. You don't stop being a human being because you're inspired. You still get information like every other human being. What about the writing of history? Like the authors of the Kings, she made use of known histories. How do we know that they used known histories? Because they tell us. They are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, and many other names that they give you, the annals of this, and the prophet Iddo, and they mention different sources. If you want to know more about this king, go to that book. They've adapted part of the history. And she says, when a historian has summarized details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted. Just like those inspired writers. So how did she use sources? Here's a summary, and this is particular to Pastor Morgan. Others have gotten some of these points, but this is my extraction from having worked on the Desired Ages in particular and other books more largely. Especially her writings on the life of Paul. I published the whole book as a document. Here's how she used sources. First, as historical background. Is that legitimate? You want to tell the story? You can. Well, but they certainly did it in the Bible, so that should be legitimate. Secondly, she used sources for perfecting her description of details. The Bible gives the outline, but then there may be some author who has described it particularly well. And so she would go to Hausen, of Coney Barrenhausen. Any of you have ever heard that name, Coney Barrenhausen? Maybe not. So if you do, okay. Coney Barrenhausen wrote an excellent book, which Adventists sold and promoted through the Review and Herald. At the same time, they were selling and promoting Ellen White's book on the same period. Nothing to hide there. They were obviously selling to some of the same people. If they read it, they would see, yes, she has used the historical background in that book to be able to tell her history, but it's with a particular slant. It's not just history. So she used it to perfect her as sources of gems of thought, which we have already described. I'm going to give you an example of one of those gems of thought. And it served as storyline guides. This is the one that people least understood. What do I mean by a storyline guide? Those of you that have ever had to write a paper for college or high school, and you're supposed to tell about some person's life, some historical person, how do you start? A shortcut is to read what one or two other people have already written. So you make sure that you cover your bases, right? Now, you may write it a little different way. You will be docked and penalized if you just mess it up a little bit. Take somebody else's account and just paraphrase a little bit here and there. That's not fair. But if you're writing and you use somebody's storyline guide that helps you to fit all the pieces together, and yet you tell it with your own point, your own perspective, you bring in other details from other sources, You weren't there, so you've got to rely on that. That's legit. She used storyline guides. And how I recognize this is that sometimes she will follow the same course, and occasionally there'll be a unique word that'll pop up here or there, and you say, what are the chances that she used that unique word here? Now, there are a lot of times you wouldn't notice a difference, because how many ways are you going to talk about the crucifixion? Nails, crown of thorns. I mean, these are all common elements. That's not going to shock you. But if you use a certain way of describing it, a key word or phrase, you say, wait a second, she may have had this in the background when she was working. But is it unique? Yeah. Does she say something different than what they say? Yeah. That's fully legitimate. And what I was trying to seed you to think about when we were talking about this before is that we've got to get away from the notion that she's just recounting visions. Because she may not have understood, she may not have seen every scene that's in the Bible that she's talking about. She may have, but she doesn't tell us whether she has. Is she inspired in how she comments on those stories? Yeah. So she's taking us through the story. It's from the Bible. It is inspired, but she's commenting on it. Did she see every scene that is described also in the Bible? Why would she need to? It's in the Bible. It's already. So these are the ways that she used sources. And if you could find another way, you can let me know. You can tell me, that you found something to add a fifth point to Pastor Morgan's list. Let's take a look at how the book Desire of Ages was put together. Now, I have to confess that I was rather naive about this, because I heard that Ellen White wrote The Desire of Ages when she was in Australia. How many of you heard that? She wrote The Desire of Ages when she was in Australia. And so my assumption was that she sat down in her cozy little chair. Now, I've told you it wasn't so cozy. But she sat down in her chair with her arms propped up, and she started off, let's see, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. All right, so I'll write about that and take the story from there down through the cross to the ascension to my God and to your God. And then that's how it was written. And that's not how it was written. She started writing about the life of Christ in a little volume over here on the far left. That's Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, where she talks about some of the scenes that were penetratingly put in her mind. And she would say, I was carried down to, and she would describe those very specifically as part of the vision. But these are highlights of the story she'd included in that part of the book. But that wasn't good enough. She wanted to write about Jesus more. So from 1858 to 1864, she wrote a little bit more on the life of Christ and about his mission to earth, entitled The Messiah, in fourth volume of Spiritual Gifts. But that wasn't enough. She started writing to children about the life of Christ in the youth's instructor articles, because she thought that it would be valuable for children to think about how that Jesus was raised and how that you can be consecrated as a child. And so she wrote some in the youth instructors about the youth of Christ. And then she wrote about other parts in Science and Times articles. And finally they said, well, let's do a renovation. And so then they did these volumes over here, the Spirit of Prophecy, volumes 2 and 3, which covers the full life of Christ through the crucifixion and into the resurrection. And those books were translated into German and French. I can't say it. Anybody know French enough to say what the life of Christ is in French? Anyway, it's a little translation, the life of Christ. And they have a different book in French than we have in English. It has some material that they started putting in, that she added to it, and they translated it. So there existed a manuscript somewhere that she wanted to produce as a life of Christ, but it wasn't good enough. she wanted more on the life of Christ. And so when she was in Australia, it isn't like she started from A to Z, but she would be impressed about one story in the life of Christ, and she might write about that same story more than once, maybe 3 or 4 times. And she would write, and then at the same time, they were asking her to write articles for the Signs of the Times, for the Review and Herald. She's a busy lady, and I don't know about you, but it takes me more than a week to write on her. It takes some research and some thought, and I'd hate to have to do that. It's one thing to get up here and speak off the cuff. It isn't perfect. You know, my language is not always exact, and you can speak, but it's another thing to write. It's got to be perfected. It takes some time. So they said, how are you going to do that? Well, they said, it's what we do. You write a manuscript, we'll turn it into an article, and then you can use it in the book. So here's what we got. These are the sources for the Desire of Ages. It's a combination using the Spirit of Prophecy as the backbone. It's the main story. It follows pretty much the same order. But then, you see this up here? Dear Brother Robinson, letters. Marion Davis, her secretary, would gather from every source where she was writing on the life of Christ, including letters. Like I mentioned, there might be one little application that she would say, wow, the way you said this just really, really hits the mark. So she would take that little piece, and that would go into the manuscript. And then she would take some of her earlier books, and then there might be something like in Steps to Christ or Patriarchs and Prophets that was applicable. So she'd take some of that. So there'd be a piece from here, a piece from there, from manuscripts that she did write when she was in Australia, as well as, what else is here? That's it. Okay, so all these little different things, they're actually maybe a little bit from even her speaking. Doesn't seem so because her oral communication is different than written. But for each of these ways, she put it together. And how I finally figured out how she did this was that D.E. Robinson came as a secretary after Desire of Ages was done, and he had the job of typing out the manuscript. Marion Davis didn't know how to type. So she didn't type it up, but she was kind of like the human gatherer, word processor. What she would do is she would get all of these things and have it retyped and have all of these different pages that were in different shapes and sizes, sometimes a little snippet here or there of something that she found, and she would number them, put them all in order, that she wanted them in the order, and she read it to the typist, who would then put it all in its proper order. Isn't it so nice to have computers these days? You can do all that by yourself. Even if you only know how to type like 2 at a time. And my daughter does not know touch typing, but she types almost as fast as I do, and I took touch typing at school. Anyway, so we'd read it all together, and once the manuscript was like in its readable form, she'd go sit down with Sister White, and they'd be reading it together, and Sister White would say, wait a second, there's something missing here. You know, we jump from here to here, there's something missing. And Mary would say, yeah, you're right. And I would say, I know just what it is. And so she would say, put this down. And so in Marion's own handwriting, which we don't even have these anymore, but she would write down that little transition that needed to go into the story. And they'd go on reading the rest of the manuscript to see how it was. And there are letters of hers that I have transcribed of Marion's, where she talks about this process and going back and forth with Pacific Press, who was going to publish it. What I've given you is the boiled down version, but the truth is that she'd have a whole chapter already done. They'd send it to Pacific Press, which was like 2 weeks away by boat. They didn't have, teletype or the internet like we have today. And send the material over there, and she'd say, hold up. I just found something really good that Ellen White wrote in a letter. I want to squeeze it in. And so they'd hold the press and they'd have to retypeset it, and not only retypeset it, because they were putting a lot of images in the first time, and those were a certain size. You could just go, if you needed a little more space. No, it was already done. So they'd have to reword it slightly so that it would fit. So they actually sent another of Ellen White's secretaries who was trusted, who would not invent some new thing, but would just refine the language enough that they could fit it. She was going to go there to the Associated Press to make those accommodations. And then the denomination said, oh, she's so good, we need her at the review. Marion said, what are you doing? Send her here for this particular job. And so they got her back, and they were able to do it. It's a marvel to me that the book Desire of Ages was ever written with all of that kind of complication. But it was. And when you read it, it's like that car I told you about with the bad fender and the hood that was replaced, and you just with the paint job, and it looks like it was always that way, right? You read Desire of Ages, and it blesses your soul. Because you read the story of Christ, and it's almost as if you're stepping down into the story. Did you have that? I had that experience when I was reading about Jesus before Herod. And I was reading, I said, she saw this. The way she described it, she saw this. It's the Bible, but it's described like, well, I had this experience that really does help it here. Am I getting out of the camera? I walked in there. Okay, you get up here. I was called in for a jury. My only time really being on a jury, and we had this fellow that was being accused. They had to follow the law. There's a guy that was supposedly making friends with people. When they go on vacation, he'd clean them out. That was the accusation. And jury selection was, he had a chance to deny people, like he was his own defense, basically, in this thing, which is a dumb thing to do. But anyway, he looked at me and I looked at him, and I said, I'm going to give this a fair shake. I'm going to give him a chance that if he's innocent, I'll say he's innocent. I'm not going to just assume, because the police are accusing him, that he was guilty. And he looked at me like, stale pass. I was a pastor, but so he accepted me in jury. And I was listening for every way that I could think that this guy might possibly be innocent, as they're telling the story. But as it ends up, he's got 5 power saws in his basement. Who needs 5 power saws unless you run a crew? And he had Carhartt clothing that only, and it was getting worse and worse for me to try to defend this guy in my mind. And the last thing, when he faulted the police because they didn't notice certain details, and obviously they couldn't have been there and he called attention to only details only he would know because he was the one who wrote them. So we went back in the room, and it was not a hard matter to say, yeah, this guy's guilty. We came to it. It was unanimous. He had eyewitness details that nobody else had. And that's what I got impressed with as I was reading Ellen White. These are details that are so unique. This is not just imagination. This is real. Anyway, so put that all together, and you have the Desire of Ages. And it's fascinating. To me, it's fascinating because I put books together. And I've edited a bunch of books, and I know the process. All right, you want an example of a thought gem? Here's one. Nevertheless, It will do us all good, frequently and solemnly, to review the closing scenes in the Savior's earthly life. Amid all the material and worldly passions by which we are beset and tempted, we shall learn many salutary lessons by going back in memory and spending a thoughtful hour, ding, 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 in the endeavor to strengthen our faith and quicken our love at the foot of the cross. Did that sound familiar a little bit? Yeah. Well, you already got Daniel March up there, so it gives it away. But I've read this to people without them saying the author, and I said, who wrote that? Ellen White? Yeah, sounds like her. Because she took that thought, Jim, and said, it would be well for us to spend a thoughtful hour each day in contemplation of the life of Christ. We should take it point by point and let the imagination grasp each scene, especially the closing ones. As we thus dwell upon his great sacrifice for us, our confidence in him will be more constant, our love will be quickened, and we shall be more deeply imbued with his Spirit. If we would be saved at last, we must learn the lesson of penitence and humiliation at the foot of the cross. Now, I know you're a prejudiced audience, but which one do you like better? You like what she did with it? Yeah. Is there a kernel of a truth that she adapted from the other fellow? Yeah. A thoughtful hour. A thoughtful hour. You know which chapter this appears in? I'm surprised if you don't, because at the dinner table I called that question and somebody quoted book and verse, book and page. This is in the chapter when Mary and Joseph, by neglect of Jesus, thinking he was okay, walked off from him and left him in the temple. And she uses that illustration to remind us that it's possible for us to forget about Jesus in the course of our activities. It would be well for us to spend a thoughtful hour in the life of Christ. See the application? Yeah. New setting. Different setting from what he had. Some of the elements. So you get the idea what thought Jim is? And do you begrudge her taking that from that passage in his writing and using it to make a point that reminds us that we really need to take time for Jesus every day. Take time to be holy. Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful explanation from her about it. So, recently, put this post on the Ellen White Reconsidered channel on YouTube. You can do videos and you can also do little posts. More people see the videos than the posts, but this one I put up because it was just, it was one of those insights as I put it together. Why is it? Why does the charge of plagiarism persist? Why does it persist? I came up with 3 reasons. I've already given you some of them, right? But this is a summary. First of all, writers have overestimated her usage of other authors. Walter Ray. Anybody heard the name Walter Ray? Okay, good. You haven't. Most of you haven't heard about him. He gave the Seventh Adventist Church a black eye in the 1980s. He's a pastor. He discovered some of these thought gems. Actually, he didn't. He plagiarized them from another guy and took credit for it. But that aside. Personal friend of mine who told me about it. We were on a podcast and we talked about it. It was in the title of it was about Ellen White, but it was giving credit. We had the actual guy. We did the research. Who Walter Ray took credit for it. He was ostensibly protected. He made this claim, and it was all over the internet, that Ellen White just willy-nilly pulled stuff off the shelves and, there's even a little cartoon of her. Can I see the prophet? No, she's busy writing and she's yanking stuff off the shelf. I don't ever republish that because it's too vivid an image and it isn't the truth. That's not the way it was. but that's the way he saw it. He found a few little things, and he came to the conclusion that she had used that 70 to 90% of her writings just were taken from somebody else. You know what the actual figure is? 4%. Yeah, that's what we've come up with. It's literal. Now, does she cover some of the same topics? If you're going to write on the life of Paul, how many topics are you going to cover that anybody else can not cover? You know, it's the same material. If you're going to write on the life of Christ, you know, are you going to tell stories that don't exist in the Gospels? Is that going to increase your credibility? You know, make stuff up that were aliens that came down and visited Jesus in Nazareth. You know, I mean, what are you going to come up with that isn't in the Bible that is helpful to people? So you're going to cover some same stuff. But as far as using the wording, like thoughtful hour and that sort of thing, 4%. This comes from Tim Poyer's research. And that includes Desire of Ages, by the way. Averaging it out. Desire of Ages actually has more careful wording from other authors than any other book. Do you know why? It's a concentration process. When Ellen White wrote a letter to somebody and she wanted to make a point very clearly, sometimes she would adapt wording from another author to make that point. Now, you suppose when she wrote that person and she borrowed some wording from another author to make that point, she was thinking, I sure hope he thinks I'm a great author. I think she was saying, I'm praying that he'll get the point. And so when you adapt from, oh, this is really well worded. Yeah, she borrowed it. She thought it was good and she used it to write to her son or to some other author, some other of the Adventists. And Marion said, let's use that. So it's going to concentrate the number of thought gems in Desire of Ages. She spent more time on the Desire of Ages than any other book in the conflict series. 8 years in Australia working. So it's a concentrate thing. That's why it's there. It's to be pithy. And as I mentioned, sometimes she would write more than one manuscript on a certain subject. How do you use that? Does anybody know anything about cinematography? Anybody? Have you ever watched the outtakes? Any of you ever watched the outtakes? Those kind of things fascinate me. I take pictures of people taking pictures. I mean, that's what I look at things. And in making a movie, 90% of your footage never makes it into the final cut. Because they want the best angle, the best lighting, the best performance. It's the same scene, but it's taken different ways, and then the editor picks out the best. That's what Marion did with Ellen White's writings to tell the story. She'd have selections, and she would pick out the one that said it the best and put that in, and then have the secretary type it out as she read it to her. So it's going to be concentrated, and Desire of Ages is concentrated, and you've noticed that, haven't you? That it's just really, really vivid. When I took Life and Teachings of Jesus at Southern Missionary College, that's one of 3 institutions that I attended all in the same place. It kept changing its name. I took Life and Teachings. One of our textbook was The Desire of Ages. And my first experience at college, they give you a little orientation and they say, for every hour in class, you should spend so much time out of class preparing for your classes. I took way too much time for Life and Teachings. I would sit there and I would read and I say, this is great. And so I started copying down in a notebook all of these great quotations from Desire of Ages. Put them down. I guess some of those have thought gems in them. I went back through. In fact, there's a video on my channel where I did this, and fewer people looked at it because they thought, oh, that's not controversial. Anyway, it was on the desired pages, and I put down in order the quotations that I had written down in my notebook. Some of them had some thought gems. Some of them did. They were original with me. Didn't matter. They told truth in such a beautiful way that it impressed me. So 4% versus 90%, you think there's a little difference there? Okay, writers have overestimated it by a long shot, and then we've already covered this. People misunderstand inspiration. They say, God wouldn't do it that way. Oh, but God did work that way in the Bible. And you know what they'll say when you say that? You're trying to destroy the Bible to protect Ellen White. Are you kidding me? Okay, guy. No, I'm saying, how does inspiration work in a work that you acknowledge as being inspired? And if you see that God can work that way, inspiring writers to write the Bible, then why is it wrong for Ellen White to do the exact same thing? Do we see a little hypocrisy here? Okay, it comes down to my third reason. Because it really doesn't have to do with the facts. The naysayers need to pick flaws. They need it to be wrong. For whatever reason. In my book, I have a list of things of why people, either they believed in Ellen White and gave up on her, or didn't believe in Ellen White and never accepted her gift for the different reasons. It comes down to personal reasons in each case. In one case, it's somebody that she said, okay, we can ordain you. It wasn't her, it was the whole church in this case, but you can be ordained as a pastor. We have these two concerns about you in your personal experience. We've already come to the conclusion that smoking is not good, and we don't want our ministers to have a bad example. So you're smoking, we would like for you to give up smoking. And we're also concerned about the fact that you're not having worship with your family. You know, doesn't the Bible say the elder leads his family and takes them with him spiritually? So we're concerned about those two things. He said, got it. I want to be ordained. I'll give up the smoking. We'll take care of the other problem too. And then he didn't give up the smoking, and he didn't fix the other problem, and then he didn't get ordained, and then he blamed Ellen White. Or the guy who had certain notions about prophecy, that he saw it this way, she saw it another way, therefore she must not be a prophet because obviously I'm the one that's right. And on it goes. Personal preference, personal perspectives, being chided, whatever, about something in their life they didn't want it. And so they needed to find some flaws. In the debate that I had, the discussion that I had, I ended up with a story talking about my dad. It just came to me on the fly because I wasn't prepped for this, but it was definitely something I had thought about. I mentioned that my folks had separated, right? I went over to my dad's house, and he had under glass photographs, some of the family. But there's this one photograph that was a chair that had a bunch of unfolded clothes crumpled up in it. And I think a desk also that had some clothes piled up. I thought, that is the weirdest thing to put under glass. But I concluded, and of course I can't check with my dad now to tell you whether it's true or not, but it seemed like that was kind of justification for why it was appropriate that he should leave. It's a reminder, that's why I left. Oh, you can help me out, thank you. Well, that's so thoughtful. He could pick that floor. In fact, one time, when I was a little frustrated with my mom later on in life, I became her primary caregiver after she had been a caregiver for my dad. My sister helped me on the weekends so I could preach, and that's how that worked. We were having a discussion about keeping things orderly, and she said, "Yeah, that's what you're going to put on my tombstone, isn't it? She couldn't keep a clean house." And I said, "No, Mom. I'm going to put, she always took time to listen." Now, with my dad, back to my dad, and his flaw that he picked in order to feel justified in his choices and where he had gone. He couldn't handle his life in the last years of his life. Dementia. And Mom took him in. Now, he wasn't so far gone that he didn't recognize me. I'm thankful for that. And I have to say, it was one of the most tremendous things in my life. If you've been a kid of a divorced family and you've had to live with that for a long time, you would wish, perhaps, like I did, that somehow that your folks could get back together. Although your better nature knows that it was kind of miserable and that's why they separated. Right? But in those last 2 years of his life, I could phone and I could talk to both of my parents the same phone conversation. That was amazing. And I could talk to my dad. And my dad would say, "Your mom's a good woman. She raised you guys. And she takes pretty good care." Yeah. He even came down before that, he moved in with her to a celebration of godly women at the church that she attended in South Florida. They had other women that were there, but he came the one time that I remember him in an Adventist church besides my brother's 8th grade graduation. He came for that to honor my mom. And he came up front and he said, "I want to thank y'all for honoring my bride." Yeah, he had already been saying the little flaws that he picked weren't good justification. And I hope that people come to that realization when it comes to Ellen. Let's see if I got it here right. Comes up next. Yeah, I got it here right. The name Dudley M. Canwright, some of you know about him, father of the critics of Ellen White, went to her memorial service, was standing there with his brother, and with choked up emotion, he said, "There is a noble Christian woman gone." He was a bit schizophrenic in the way that he criticized her. And yet, when it counted, he knew what kind of a woman she was. Those who think that she's trying to deceive somebody by using wording from other people to make the message get through, to communicate, are misunderstanding. That's where I think they get it wrong. And I can show that. I can demonstrate it from the evidence. I can give multiple examples, more than I've given this afternoon. And strangely, they don't all change their minds because they have a vested interest in not doing so. Lord, help them. Pray for them. Love them. Do all you can. Don't fight them. Doesn't do any good. Your job is to love them. Let God take care of it. You can tell the truth. You can advertise my videos. But leave it to God. Ready for some Q&A? You want to start the ball, Jeff?
Yeah.
Here, let me hand you the mic so it's on record.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that probably come to mind. You talked about the literary borrowing percentage, 4%. Is that, that type of a percentage can just get very complicated to calculate? Is the 4% where we find like direct wording? So there's some other percentage, like you said, whether it's storyline guides or things like that, where you can tell, hey, this concept was written about here and there. That's not trying. That's almost impossible even to account for.
Right.
How can you do that? So when you say 4%, you're talking about.
Oh, good. Right. We can use dual-mic microphones. Good. Yeah. I refer to this as being Tim Poyer's study, and he called it Project Surprise because people expected far more. And the way that he would mark it's not a published study. He has a separate library in his office at the Ellen G. White Estate in Silver Spring, Maryland, where whenever friend or foe has sent him material where there is a clear reference from one author to another. So it's verbal similarity. It is about verbal similarity. He will mark it in the book and then he updates it according to lines of text. So some people use sentences as the criteria. That was in the Desire of Ages study. It was done in the 80s. He's doing lines of text. So it becomes a percentage of the lines in the book that have noted similarity. And I didn't go through all of the books in the library, in his library to verify his methodology, but I did look at one, and because I was looking at Desire of Ages actually, and there was one that he marked. I thought, really? So there may be some even there that it's like somebody said it was very similar, and okay. There's a guy, I'm not going to give his name because he's asked to remain anonymous, but he's a Seventh-day Adventist retired pastor who does copious work of these kinds of comparisons. Only his criteria is, if it's sort of the same in this author, I'll mark it as being her source. And I was like, no, I think literally it has to have some verbal linkage. And so he's got pages and pages of stuff. I have a video, it's called Copied or Not Copied, where I just took all of his examples in order, starting in order, and I just went right through them. And I have these voices in the background that respond to it. Okay, is it copied or not copied? And you hear, yeah. So, and one time my wife was hearing me doing this so much that she said, I was recording something else and I heard her go, so I put her in with the rest of them on one of them. But anyway, her voice is not that high, but it's at a distance, the Doppler effect. So it's that's the methodology for it. It's about lines of text. Okay. Any others?
Just to follow up on that same note, I saw this just probably a little while back, but it came up more recently on social media. This is from somebody who interacts and goes on videos with the same person that runs the channel that you were on. So on his social media, he was circulating this idea that Dr. I forget how you say his last name, Fortin.
Denny Fortin.
Yeah, Fortin and Andrews has said, oh, the Great Controversy is like 80% based on Paradise Lost, I think by John Milton.
Yeah.
What's your understanding of that?
Funny you should ask.
Yeah.
I have Denny Fortin's emails in line to him about that subject right here. Okay, so you can see it. I'll call attention to part of it, so you don't have to read all the text there. But I was aware of this statement and it seemed, wow, that's intriguing. Just to give you some background, Dr. Fortin and I, he's Canadian, French Canadian speaking. So his first language is French. That's why it's Denis Fortin. He and I collaborated on some research on Steps to Christ. My intent was to study through Steps to Christ and see what materials were used of Ellen White's to be put into that book. As I told you, it's a compilation of writings from the Review and Herald, different sources. The first chapter is actually a manuscript, a fresh manuscript. And so that was to answer a certain accusation, and that was some people said that she didn't write the book, but their secretary wrote the book. You know what the lady's name is? It's going off my head right now. But anyway, she was an editor. And she took more, what is it? That was her secretary, that was her helper. Yeah, I think her. No, Marion Davis is a good girl. She didn't do that. What was her name? Anyway, Fanny Bolton. Okay, now I see the heads nodding, and not just because you're sleeping. I saw a few of those a little bit before, so I tried to up my ante a little bit here to get a little more, Fanny Bolton was a writer on her own right. She had been a reporter, and it was galling for her to just be an editor and not get her name. As mentioned, I have edited over 50 books. Do you know how many of those my name appears as the editor? Maybe one. Editors don't get acknowledgement for it, which is kind of good, because if you didn't agree with what you're editing, you're not connected with it. Hey. But Fanny had a hard time dealing with that, and so she would say, those really good words here, those are mine. I wrote that, and so the word got around, and so finally there was this rumor that she had written Steps to Christ. And so my response was to go through and show that these are articles that were written before Fanny ever worked for Ellen White. And there's even one article that predates Fanny's birth that's in Steps to Christ. So anyway, both he and I, Denny Fortin and I, reviewed the same material to try to document where each of the parts of those chapters came from. Some of them are larger sections, some of them are smaller, and then they were arranged by Marion Davis in the order that they were published, and with Ellen White saying, yes, that's what I wanted to say. As an editor, I understand that process, because there are editors that like to change what the original author has said. They disagree with their conclusions and they fix that. And that's not what an author is supposed to do. An author is supposed to make the editor is supposed to make the author present it the best language that they have. In fact, I did this with a friend of mine. I didn't agree with it. I wrote my own articles to respond to it. I said, but my job as an editor is to make your best case. That's what I do. So Fanny had a hard time with that, and rumors got around, and so we substantiated that. I'm giving you a real long story here. And we showed that it's Ellen White's materials all the way through. But in the course, I discovered that there were some thought gems, a few of them, in Steps to Christ, that came from somebody else, that were adapted, a few of them. And so I sent that to Dr. Fortin as part of what I did. That's not published in the book. They didn't put that in the book. It's on my article that's on academia.edu. That wasn't his purpose. He just wanted to show where Ellen White's materials were used. And so his response to me, and Denny, please, if you see this, sometime it's circulating on the internet, pardon me for making it plain. But he said, so they're saying that her writing is mostly derived. I said, say what? Out of all of the material, we had a few thought gems. And he was thinking that it tilted it largely derived. So I think he was kind of thinking that way. Maybe he had done some of this study before. Anyway, all right. So this is on the great controversy. And the way that it was presented and has been presented, it would make you think that from the get-go, when Ellen White is writing on the great controversy, that she's taking her stuff from Milton's Paradise Lost, right? That's what it sounds like. Okay. So I asked him, I inquired, and we responded a little bit about it, and then we finally came down. He says the most obvious parallels and dependence are found in Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1. Okay. And then he says, I do not believe that Ellen White copied from Milton, as the literary genres are too different. Yeah, because Milton is all poetry. Have any of you read Milton? If you have, you get an A for this class. I mean, it's for me, it's really hard to read, and I've never read Beowulf either, you know. But my daughter did, and she understood it, so more power to her. But you know, this I had a hard time with Milton, and even what in the world is he saying? You know, I'm not really a poetry guy, and some people are. I'm a prose guy. Anyway, so here's what this is the conclusion I wanted you to see right here at the bottom. Jim misquoted me here. I was comparing Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, and Paradise Lost. Okay, let's see if we can get any extra credit for anybody who would tell me in what stage in development of the Great Controversy presentation Spirit of Prophecy is. When did she first write about the Great Controversy? 1858. Spiritual gifts. Okay, so that's her initial writing. It's not comparing that. It's Spirit of Prophecy, which is by that time, after she had written Facts of Faith, which is Volume 3 and Volume 4 of Spiritual Gifts, where she's going through the Bible, telling the story, and then bringing out the facts of faith. So should it be any surprise that by the time you get down to this second iteration in Spirit of Prophecy, she's rewriting it, that she's going to be telling the same stories as Milton? Now, are there some conclusions that are tipped in one way or another? And these were things, the language describing, for example, let's say, the serpent. Okay, what did the serpent look like? We all have our own idea of it because we've read Ellen White's writings, or most of us have read those. And so, how did the snake get about?
Legs.
Yeah. Did you know that other people think he had legs? And but Milton says the wings. So obviously she got it from him, huh? But if it had wings, whether Milton got it right or not, that's what she says. So these are some of the kind of things here. So it's not the original writings. And the same thing, I have a whole comparison. This is, you know, this is painful stuff for most people. But I have a whole comparison comparing spiritual gifts with another book that was called The Great Controversy. Did anybody heard of The Great Controversy Between God and Men? People that sat at my table do. You talk about this. Yeah. Okay. It was written by a fellow by the name of H.L. Hastings, and he wrote his own book, and they said, she stole it from him. I said, okay, show me the proof. Okay. Well, here in Patriarchs and Prophets, there's a similar statement to Patriarchs and Prophets. Wait a second. You said he got spiritual gifts published in 1858 from him, and you're going down to 1890 and you're finding some similarity to compare to his book to say that's why her first book came, because she used some language that was similar to his language. How many years? 20 years later? 22. No, you got to show it to me in the first thing to say she got the idea. And so I compared it carefully over and over again, and I found one sentence is a possible connection about John being boiled in oil or something. Anyway, it was just one reference that was similar to his, but everything else, his whole premise, his objective, he's saying, man rebelled from God, and in the end, guess who's going to win? Spoiler alert, God wins. That's not what Ellen White's talking about, is she? Yeah, she does talk about man's rebellion, but that's not the main thing. It's about the spiritual warfare that's going on behind the scenes and how he suckers us into that and how he's messing up human lives. But in the end, who wins in that battle? The devil or Jesus? Jesus. Yeah. So very, very different things. So they do the same kind of thing. It's everything I can do to be magnanimous with people who are not being very careful. I don't want to say mean things. Yes,
Okay,
let's get her the microphone so she's on record here.
yes, thank you. Okay, and the great controversy, there's a lot of reference to de Bonnier
Yes,
as a quote.
right.
So, how do you reconcile that?
Well, clearly he's one of her historical sources, isn't he?
Yes.
And she says plainly that she used sources. This was another time where I got a little bit irritated, but you know what? There are things that I don't see firsthand. Somebody hasn't pointed out to me. I kept misspelling some lady's name years ago, and she said, "You know, I put up with this for years. Kevin noticed my name was spelled this way. Oh, I'm so sorry." You know, so we all don't see certain things, but I'm hearing for years that Ellen White created a crawl out by acknowledging in the 1888 Great Controversy, the statements that I quoted up here about, where if a source explained the material that she used it, and sometimes without giving credit. Well, in 1888, she didn't give credit. In 1911, she did. They're changing standards of documentation. And so when she was notified that by that time that was the accepted practice, she said, by all means, put it in. And so they went to the Herculean efforts of going to libraries. Today, I've already documented some other stuff. I just go on the internet and I search on words and I can find stuff and put in the reference, and it only takes me 3 weeks. It took them a long time to do that, but they did it. Okay, so Davigné is one of her historical sources, and there's nothing to apologize about that.
Okay, another point. Some are saying that others, after Sister White's passing, has adapted and put in quotations that she herself never approved of.
Okay. And there you're dealing with the skepticism of the human mind, and which makes it more difficult because you say, what proof did they have that happened versus what you could present as evidence that it didn't happen? All I can say is that in the course of the work that I've done with Ron Graybill that I've already mentioned, where we have taken original manuscripts and we have retranscribed them, I don't find that happening. What I have found, and in one case, we found this one manuscript that it looks like it was a scratch manuscript that she didn't intend to be published exactly as she had it written, but she signed off on it when they transcribed it and edited it to state what she wanted. Occasionally, she will say something too frankly in a manuscript, and then she thinks about the audience and thinks about proper deference. You don't want to call somebody out, or you don't want to be too direct about some things. And so there are times that you don't say things that are true, but you have to phase them out. So in editing it, that's why she would have people read it. I mentioned this. There's a quotation where she says, "Please get Uriah to what she didn't use the word critique, to criticize it." We're all blind to our own words. When we write something down, we're not aware that sometimes if we say something a certain way, one mind will take that and say, "Do you mean?" And so she would have a number of people, in particular, on the first chapter of Desire of Ages, she had a panel of people that would read it through. It almost was produced in a whole different form, but it's made up of little snippets from her writing to an exquisite description of the incarnation. It's amazing description. But she had numerous people read it and give their feedback. And some of it was helpful and some of it was not. And ultimately, it took the form that it is now. And right now, it is one of the most honed and careful presentations on what it meant for God in heaven to become flesh, God with us. And Kevin, you had one.
Many questions. I'll try to limit it to two. I think they're easier than what we've been going through.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for all your dedication to this and coming and sharing with us. It's been fun. So after I flattered you, when you're talking about Elamite's first vision after the great disappointment, I was wondering if you can also harmonize in there where Hiram Edson came in time-wise and the effect of that. Maybe you can't, but
it's a good point.
I'm just wondering, because I was expecting you to talk about him as you went through that, and then you did. I'm like, I wonder how that exactly fits together.
I get this all the time. Somebody come up to me afterward and say, "Why didn't you talk about this?" Okay, well, that's a good point. We'll give you a chance to say it.
Okay.
All right. So as far as Hiram Edson, his great insight was that Jesus went into a new phase of his ministry, going into a different part of the heavenly sanctuary. She doesn't really address that in the first vision. It's not until the bridegroom vision, which is the one, if you remember me pointing up there to Atkinson in that area, that's the Exeter vision. That's when she had a vision that had to do with the same subject. And that changed her mind about things. I'm not going to go into that right now, but but that's when she had an affirmation of it, when she saw that point. The point of the first vision was about the midnight cry.
Yeah.
Okay, next question.
Not everybody here is born and raised and in depth with Adventist history. I wonder if you could just spend like 2 minutes discussing HMS Richards. Oh, I mean, it's a wonderful story, a great man, but probably
Okay,
a lot of people are like, okay, why'd you pick
So
that
who
guy?
is he? Yeah. Well, HMS Richards Sr. was a pioneer in radio ministry in the Seventh Adventist Church at a time when the denomination had some skepticism about using this medium that was mostly used popularly, for the devil's work. Kind of reminds me of the fellow that came up to the preacher and he said, "I got $20 here that I'd give you, but I got it gambling." And the preacher went, "Devil's had it long enough." So I think that's how HMS Richards saw radio ministry, and he began a local broadcast in I guess it was in California to start. I'm not sure, but it was a local channel at first, and then he started getting more affiliates, and eventually the church accepted it. So he was a pioneer in radio broadcast. As far as his own lineage as an Adventist, his father had been a pastor before him. And was very respected. And HMS came up with a little bit of mischief in his life. He notably was nearly blind in one eye. I mean, almost absolutely blind in one eye. And yet, where did I do with that? Yes. you could see him walking to work like that, reading. He read incessantly with that one fairly good eye and the other really poor eye, and read numerous books, lots of material, and used it in his broadcasts to broaden his appeal. There's some great stories about him, about when he was doing evangelism, and somebody offered him something to drink. Do you remember that one? He was offered something to drink, and of course they meant alcoholic. And he said, I want the strongest thing you've got. So what? Yes, the stuff that floats 1,000 boats. Could you get me some water? Yeah.
So, related to the eyesight thing,
Yes.
as I understand it, a lot of times when he was preaching, he would act like he's looking at the Bible,
Oh yeah.
but really he had it memorized, and he was just repeating it from memory.
He's a great guy.
Yeah.
Wonderful guy. And his son filled his shoes for a number of years, H.M.S. Richards Jr., who had the same lovely voice. Yeah. Nobody could fill those shoes. All right. Yes, back there. One of you guys are going to come up with something that I won't have an answer for, but we'll see how that goes.
Thank you so much for your presentation and the time taken. So I don't really have any, I guess, concerns with new Adventists that are coming in and kind of having skepticism or questions about Ellen White. I mean, that to me is like normal and healthy to want to, try to discover that. How do you deal with the skepticism amongst Seventh-day Adventists that are pretty, they've been in it for a long time, they still are resisting, pretty plain counsel about various things, and there's this underlying just kind of negativity about her writings. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. You mentioned like love and, loving those and that's like the answer for everything. But just how do you deal with that skepticism and amongst those that have been in it a long time?
My first pastorate was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and we used to have home cottage prayer meetings. People lived so far away from the church, so it made more sense to go to a central home and meet there. And one family there, lovely people, had kids, had nearly left the church because of Ellen White. They had were very negative views about her. And so, of all things, our Bible study for prayer meeting was the life of Christ. So you can guess what one of my resources was. And it was humorous, as I would share different insights as we were, studying through the life of Christ, looking at it in the Bible. He asked me, where do you get all this good stuff? And I fudged a little bit because I had more than one source. I did use Eatershine. I said, well, I study Eatershine. But I felt bad about not giving him the full thing, just simply because I didn't want to turn him off. You know what I'm saying? I think there's nothing to be gained by pushing it in somebody's face. And I've had some people that have been down on Ellen White, but they love Desire of Ages. So it's probably something else, lifestyle issue or something that it kind of cramps their style. And God love them. The Lord can save people with a number of things, and I'm not going to list them off, that have been traditional Adventist standards, but God can still save them, And so that's not my business. But one thing I did decide to do after that experience was I'm not going to preach entirely without the footnotes. Because if I do that, people aren't gonna know where I got my source, and they can't go get it for themselves. So, what do? Now, I don't use that expression, maybe many of you remember this from the 80s and on. A favorite author of mine says, it's like, well, glad she's your favorite author, but why don't you tell us who it is?
Kind of inspiration.
Yeah, or inspiration says, well, I think that's a euphemism that most people would understand, you know, at least the people on the inside. But I would say, I found this really great statement in Desire of Ages. Okay. What does that do? Well, it gives a footnote, but it also says, hey, there's some good stuff in this book. I think you'd enjoy it. And so that's what I do, and I try to build on that basis. And I tried a whole series on the Great Controversy. I went through it chapter by chapter. Amazingly, their favorite presentation was God's no-name defense. There were a bunch of, I don't know if you read through the chapters on the Reformation in French countries and stuff. There are a bunch of names that I didn't recognize. So I called them the no-name defense, you know, and that seemed to resonate because it's like saying, hey, I'm no big name, but God can use me too. You know, so that went well, but some of it was kind of like, come on, can you get past this? It was a little bit, you know, choke the folks a little bit. So I've experimented with different things, but mostly is present the positive, give them a chance to try something good, and let them. I mean, who accepts her gift because somebody shoved it down your throat? Who does? It doesn't work. And I have to tell you, my mom never did that. You know, I lived to the age, Kevin, maybe you know, you know the age when there were parents and there were teachers that Ellen White says don't do that, and they used, you know, they wagged their finger at you, and you kind of figured that she was a stick in the mud. She was not. Let me tell you a couple of things here. I have these and thoughts to present, but I didn't have a picture to remind me to say it. So here goes. Ellen White was not as rigid as a lot of people who follow her. Okay, let me give you some examples. Okay, I happen to be a vegan. That's my choice. But you don't have to be a vegan or even a vegetarian to be a Seventh-day Adventist, right? Because that's a choice. And we emphasize health. Why is that? Because the Bible says our body's the temple of the Holy Spirit. So we need to take care of this temple because it ain't ours. But how you do that, that's up to you. Now, you're going to take some counsel, you can take some counsel from her or not. But even as much as I derive my conclusion that I would probably be better off being vegan, my choice, Ellen White was never a vegan in her entire life. So I'm not copying Ellen White. I do it for rationale that I get from there, you know, disease in animals and cholesterol, and the things that I can reason through. I don't force that on other people. And neither did she. In fact, you know, my wife and I have a little bit of a difference on this, but having studied at UG Pines and given health talks on the benefits of whole grain products, I like to get whole grain products as much as I can. That's not to say I wouldn't eat some white products, you know, if that's what I had to eat, but I prefer whole grain products. I will eat ramen on occasion. So anyway, as much as she would emphasize whole grain products, she had a guest that came to her house who really preferred white bread. She sent out for somebody to go buy him some white bread so that he would have something to eat that he would enjoy. When she was in Australia, there were men who worked to help build the college during a depression who weren't getting paid, and they were still working with the hope that they would eventually get paid. And she said, go sit down for some meat for these guys. There was a guy that was up in Norway. This is kind of an anecdotal story, but there's a guy up and these are all on health, and we can look at it in other ways as well. Oh, by the way, yes. Do any of you know about the airbrushed photograph of Ellen White? She had a pendant that she was wearing that they airbrushed out because it would be a scandal to the brethren. She was wearing it. You know why? Well, actually, it wasn't a pendant. It was a necklace. It was given to her by her niece. She was wearing a gift from her niece. Come on, guys. They airbrushed it out of the photo because it would bother somebody. I'll give you another one. When she was traveling across country in a train, it's kind of hard to get food. Where are you going? She brought something from the sanitarium. And in a letter, we know what it was. When they published it in the testimonies, they overlaid it. We'll get to you, okay? And what was it? It was a condensed kind of chicken that she could reconstitute and have a meal while she was traveling. And they left it out because it would be a scandal to the brethren. She's not as rigid as a lot of people think. Now, did she teach those things? Yes. Did she aim for a certain mark that we should be healthy and that we should take care of these bodies because they don't belong to us? Yes. But the rigidness, yeah. She's first and I'll come to you. Okay.
I just had this is like your commercial moment. So
Okay.
how do we get in touch with or get a copy of your book? Is it going to be on Amazon? Is it going to be Pacific Press?
It's being published by Teach Services. She's asking about the book Glory, Glory, Glory. And Jeff will have some material here for you. In fact, I'll give you the link. What I'll give you the link is to the online additional materials. It has an advertisement for the book in it. It's at press, so it will be available through Teach Services, and they usually do advertise. You just do a search and you'll find it on Amazon or wherever it's available. There, they will be the distributor. Okay. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for coming and talking.
Yeah.
For reference, I'm a fairly new Adventist, so in my studying of Ellen, I've gained a lot of blessings. And in my devotional, I was reading about unfallen worlds. And I'm wrestling with that because, I know in Job, that's pretty, that's.
The sons of God come together, right?
Yeah, sons of God come together. And I asked a Bible study group, and they were talking about, there's a verse in Colossians, Hebrews, and Revelation 12:12, and all these verses. But I was wondering if there are any other more specific verses that you know of, or where in the spirit of prophecy can I get more information for a little more clarity?
Yeah, well, I think you outlined pretty much the support for it in Scripture. We do have indication that we're not alone in the universe, that there are others. How far away is it? That's a good question. And how many of them are there? We don't know. But her description of those are just a couple, I think, where she talks about other worlds, and she talked about beings there of different sizes. I don't know how controversial that would be. So I'm not sure what part of it is difficult.
I guess I was just looking to flesh it out a little more in scripture, but.
I mean, you've got the basis that's a good possibility. There's another verse that we would refer to, and that is that God created the earth to be inhabited. And thus, if you make a planet that is habitable, chances are you intended that it have inhabitants on it, right? And she talks about, I think what you're referring to, she talks about that there were a planet that had a tree similar to the tree in the garden, and that they did not violate God's trust, whereas the people on earth did. And that possibility, there's nothing in Scripture that describes that kind of thing. Yeah, but she had that insight, and it seems reasonable, even if you didn't believe in her gift.
All right.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
Lindsay had a question.
Yeah, I put her off and we'll go.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes.
There are a few published dates for the Great Controversy, starting from 1858, I think was the original publishing date. And then I saw one with 1848, 1888, and then
1884.
1911.
Right.
So why the various?
What's the
publishing
difference?
dates? Yes, what's the difference?
Okay. As you saw in the image, the little book, Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, is the original, 1858. And it was titled The Great Controversy Between Christ and His Angels and Satan and His Angels, that longer title. It got shortened as it went on. When she rewrote the whole series, which it's kind of a reorganization, we might say. As I said, I don't think she had in mind the projection of what she was going to be dealing with when she started writing. Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, is dedicated to the Great Controversy, but the next volume in the series is not about that at all. It's about her life. The third volume has some about the Great Controversy in the Bible, but it also has a part, let's see, not there, but part 4, it's spilled over into Volume 4, and there's a whole section in there on health. So it's kind of topical section. They reorganized it to rewrite it in the Spirit of Prophecy series and also amplified it. So the reason for the redoing of it is to include more historical information and put God's reference on those. The 1884 is part of the set of the Spirit of Prophecy set. It's Volume 4. But it was also published alone in 1885, 1886. I have a copy of that in my library, and it's just the same text, so it didn't change there. They just published it alone.
And then the 1911.
And then 1888 is a little different. In 1888, Ellen White had just spent 3 years in Europe. And when she was in Europe, she would go through some part of town, like in Zurich, Switzerland, or some other place that had to do with Reformation. And she would say, such and such, this happened here. I've seen this place. That seems strange to us, but there are places in Europe that still have the same buildings that were there 500 years ago. If anything is over 30 years here, it's old, right? So we have a different perspective on that. And so she would see these things and it would remind her of something. She'd say, I should include that in the book. There was one great story that she was that her son was reading about. He comments on it. He said, hey, I just found this amazing story. It's about the Hussites and the Hussite War, and how that the Catholic forces, which vastly outnumbered the Hussites, came to attack them, but then God gave the smaller band of Hussites victory over this larger army. And she talked about this. Then Ellen White picked it up and she finished the story. He had just been reading it, and she said, "You know about that, Mom, or Mother?" She said, "Mom, you know about that?" And she said, "Yes, I saw that in vision." He said, "Well, then why isn't it in Great Controversy?" She said, "I didn't know where it went. But now that I do know," so that wasn't in the original 1884. It was put in the 1888. Yeah. And then what's the difference between 1888 and 1911? Footnotes, mostly footnotes. Because people said, you really should give your sources. And that's expected today, she said, by all means. Now, there are a few little other changes that were made there. I don't want to go into too many weeds on this, but she said, I want this to be so well documented that the average person reading it would not say, I don't know about that. And so she gave it to, what was the name? The guy, an Adventist scholar who was a really careful scholar. And Prescott, that's right. Prescott, and he went through it. he gave her a list of like 100 different things that he thought should be revised or changed, and she signed off on 50 of them, about 50 of them. And what did she sign off on? Well, I'll give you a couple examples. He says there's a debate in the scholarly world about which bell tolled. You know about this one?
We were there last year.
Oh, you went to the on a tour?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Great Controversy Tour.
Yeah. I've never been on one. But yeah. Okay, so which tower is what signaled the massacre of the Saint Bartholomew's massacre of the Huguenots? A debate among scholars. So she had what one group of scholars would have said was the first tolling, and then others thought that it was another, that it started somewhere else. So question is, which one was first? Who knows? So instead of saying, well, I said it was that one and we're going to stick with that one, she said, it really doesn't matter. So they changed it to a bell tolled signaling the massacre. Isn't that the major point? Yeah. Oh, what are some other examples? Yeah. Oh, you have some?
Dr. Domstein was researching that. I think it was him.
Okay.
Just a few years ago.
All right, let's get this on recording too.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Dr. Domstein was
I think it's
researching
Dr.
it.
Domstein, that's who led our tour.
Okay.
I think it was him, but maybe he was referencing somebody else's research, but they went and did the research pretty recently, last few years, and came to the conclusion that she was right the first time.
She just didn't want to have a great controversy about the great controversy. I had to use that line. Yeah.
Can I recommend?
Yeah. Yeah, and another, there's some others that she did similar thing, that I think that she was right. She said that, the Waldenses were the first in Europe to have their own translation of the Bible. And Prescott said, well, what about these other people? Didn't they come in earlier? Well, if you read a little more about the history of the Waldenses, they go back all the way to northern Italy, and they had the old Italian version. It's before the Vulgate. And that was their language, and it predates the one that he pointed to. So she just said, it's not worth, causing a ruckus over a minor point. She said, among the first. So that was just deference rather than that she was wrong. I think she was right. Okay. Are there times that she's ever been incorrect? Oh, they make a big deal about some. And these are all just the little nits to pick, that people have. In describing the Herod, you've already, okay, you want to tell it?
No, I heard it from your research and I shared it when I.
Okay, you remember, okay, good. Well, that makes me feel good. You saw what I said. Yeah, it's not a big deal, but Ellen White was describing the Herod, and if you're just reading through the Gospels and Acts, would you know that it's a different Herod? It just says Herod. Yeah. So you would assume that it's the same Herod, and she tells the story as if it's the same Herod. But when she was working on sketches from the life of Paul, which she had the historical work of Coney Barrenhausen, she recognized that there had been a change, that the Herod in the crucifixion story had died, and there was another Herod there, okay? And
I
so,
think there were three Herods, Herod Antipas, Herod the Great, and Herod the grandson, something like that.
and the Gospels and Acts does not distinguish them, doesn't use those secondary names. It just says Herod. So how would you know? This is a major point. Get this one down. The gift of prophecy is not the gift of omniscience.
Amen.
So they learn things, prophets learn things like we do, but they have one source more. And it doesn't mean that they know everything. All right, yes.
Okay, one thing that I would encourage folks to do, you really want to know who Sister White is, read the book, My Life Sketches.
Yeah.
And it really outlines how frail she was
Mhm.
for most of her life,
Yeah,
right? With a third grade education and with a lot of physical ailments. And she had to, endure a marriage. She had children. She dealt with the loss of her baby. And she dealt with a lot of things. She was human,
right.
in as much as God used her. And she was not God's first choice. He
Right.
first called William Boyd to do this work. William rejected. She also called Hiram. He too rejected.
Yeah.
And-
Foy and Foss, yeah.
Yes, right. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the two F's. No, you got them right.
Yeah, and now God chose this young disabled girl. And it was a responsibility, and she realized how tremendous it was,
Heavy, yeah.
right? Yet she was willing. Are we willing, in spite of our infirmities, in spite of some of our limited education, in spite of whatever our circumstances are? Are you dealing with grief?
Yeah.
Are you dealing with other things that she dealt with?
Right.
And the most thing that pressed her was her physical condition, her illnesses. And yet she wrote and wrote and wrote. And you talked about her arthritic situation,
Yeah.
condition, and we should have a sympathy for her.
Right.
And an awesome respect for her,
Yeah.
for the work that she has done in the time that God had given her. And let us not join the naysayers, but let us hold up the banner. God used her to help us. And that's why she made it clear. She never wanted to be made a pastor, ordained, or she was never looking for such recognition.
That's right.
She just wanted to do the work for God. And I think that is the message to all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, on the point of the prophet's burden, how much fun is it, do you think it would be? And if you do think it would be fun, don't answer. How fun would it be to have to go to somebody who's engaged in the middle of adultery and call them out for it, and they're a public person preaching? How much fun is that? How much fun is it, to call out fanaticism and then to be accused of engaging in the very thing that you have been decrying? The prophet's burden is heavy, and if you've had responsibility of some sort, you do have some idea. If you've been a parent, sometimes your kids don't understand what you're doing, even though you're doing the best for them. If you're a leader in the church, you make decisions sometimes that people don't understand, and you're trying to do the best for them. And it's a heavy burden, and you can't complain. Your job is to just to do your job.
And she faced a lot of backlash in her time from the elders and the powers that be.
Yeah. Some people think that they shipped her off to Australia.
There you go, exiled her.
Yeah, and there are two different reasons why the people have posited, but she took it as God's leading, and God certainly used the experience. This is
Two questions, Pastor. Number one, I'm so sorry to have to address this, but for opponents like Desmond Ford, when he says that every date used by Adventists are wrong, how dates such as 538 to 1798, there's no history of papal dominance. AD 31, Christ didn't die that year, and certain others. How do you address those concerns from the person of a Dr. Ford and the influence that he's had on old time, new babes? How do you address that? And then my second question will be your take on Joel 2, Acts 1, and whether any other prophets might come along in these last days that would have the influence or the type of work that Ellen White has.
Okay, well, good heavy questions.
Yeah.
We may have reached the one that I said that we might come that I don't have a good answer for. As far as, Desmond Ford is passed away now, but he still does have influence, and I have not gotten into all of the details of whatever he's presented. I do know that he had respect for Ellen White in a number of ways, and that he still loved the Sabbath, and that he had his own particular views of the investigative judgment per se, and that's where he had any separation from the church, that he did not willingly or intentionally wish to leave the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so I think in some ways that he wished to support the church, but he had some different views. Prescott also had some different views. And yet he was still supportive of Ellen White in other ways. He never left the church. It has been in my experience that there are different levels of evidence that people take to come to their conclusions. And particularly if someone gets a doctorate in a certain area, sometimes it's hard to suggest that you might be wrong. So it's difficult to weigh those things out. There is a book on 538. I don't know if you've seen it. Somebody did a whole lot of research that validates that year in connecting with 1798. An awful lot of work. I saw it. I haven't read it, but it looks very good. Published by Teach Services. And so I think that in some cases we have people that are conscientious, that come to different conclusions, they have looked at different evidence, and so they may present things that are different than what we have traditionally seen. How much of that can we live with, and how much is going to disturb it? In my experience as a pastor, I don't see even church members walking in 100% lockstep on every point. So we allow people difference of conclusion. We state our case. If you have stronger evidence, you can present it. Doesn't mean you have to change their mind or change yours. But there's good evidence for that. There was one point that Samuel Bakioki, God rest his soul, he presented a point that he disagreed about the Waldenses, that there's not evidence that the Waldenses had been Sabbath keepers. And I was validating that history for another book that I never published, but it was on the Sabbath through the years. And I found evidence that said that they did, not 100%, but Ellen White's statement doesn't say that it was 100% of the Waldenses. She said there were Sabbath keepers among the Waldenses. That can be validated. And Pastor John Voorman, Jan Voorman of the Netherlands, has done research on that, provided me some evidence that he found in some French books that he could translate. He's trilingual at least. And so there's evidence for some things that well-meaning people like Samuel Bakioki hadn't seen, so he opined on it, not knowing. And I think that happens sometimes. And, God bless him.
Can you answer her second question, her part 2 question, which was
Okay.
on Acts and Joel, and your thoughts about the gift of prophecy and the very closing?
Okay, good. Okay, yeah, thank you for, my wife usually does that if I forget something, but thank you for stepping in and it's fully a possibility. And in fact, the descriptions says your sons and your daughters, as if it's more than one. So the difficulty has been in vetting individuals who have put themselves forward as that very thing. There was a lady, what was it? It starts with an R, Rowan, something like that, who actually had somebody sneak into the White Estate and introduce documents that would validate her gift. But it was found out, and so she was caught red-handed, and she ended up involved in a plot to kill somebody and carried out a murder and went to prison over it. So she wasn't a very good prophet. There was a lady named Santron. I don't know if any of you heard of this lady, who's French speaking, who was presenting messages that sounded a lot kind of like Ellen White stuff, but a little bit different. And it was mostly things that you could agree with, but the church vetted her and determined that she wasn't. And I haven't heard anything more of her. So there's been that difficulty, but there is certainly that possibility. And what would it take for somebody to take that responsibility? As you mentioned, Foss and Foy. Foss was a shirt-tail relative of Ellen White, married to a sister. He's the brother-in-law of Ellen White's sister. And so they met in Maine when she visited in Poland. And he was the one who rejected it. Actually, William Foy, I don't believe he rejected it. If you've read Benjamin Baker's book on it, he's got an updated version of that. He doesn't either. I go a little bit different than Dr. Baker on it, in that and this is in my book, by the way. There's an adjunct part in here. I think he was just ill-equipped to understand what he was given in visions. And he remained a preacher to the end of his days, and he didn't die shortly after, as Loughborough reported. Loughborough just didn't know. He just disappeared, but he didn't die. And
Can you clarify, because I think I misheard,
Okay.
are you talking about William Boyd right now, or Hazen Foss right now?
Foss gave up.
Yeah, we know Foss gave up.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that, that something was a distant relative, and I wasn't sure if you were saying William Boyd.
Yeah, I used too many pronouns in there. I was talking about Foss. Foss was the relative.
Okay.
Yeah, Foy was not a relative. Yeah, right, did I not? There's some sneaky business, people hopping some fences. Yeah, I got some theories, but anyway. Yeah, anyway, as far as William Foy, he seemed to be a very honorable person as far as we can tell. But if you compare his published visions to Ellen White's visions, you would question why he thought it was the exact same vision. And I don't think it was. It may have been a later vision that she was telling about that was similar to a vision of his, because there's one that about the 3 steps. This is in the book. About the 3 steps, and it seems like it's the same one. But the one that he's describing, there are some tangential similarities, because they go visit this wonderful place, exotic place. And at the end of the story, this is a cute little part of the end of the story. At the end of the story, he sees this wonderful food that's there, and he says, "Can I have some?" And they say, "Oh, only those people that stay here can have it." And so he tries to sneak and get some, and the next thing you know, he's out fishing. So he's a little bit mischievous. Ellen White said, "Oh, okay." But there's some, when he describes what he sees, there's some little puzzles in there. For example, he comes from a Baptist background. She came from a Methodist background. You think that some of these things she might have thought the same too, but her understanding of the state of the dead is different from his. And so he keeps talking about spirits and that he became a spirit. And he talks about angels that had a human mother. I enumerate a number of these little things that are kind of like, how did he understand it? Did he see the same thing? He could have seen some of the same things, but his interpretive lens, he interprets it a different way.
Like I kind of interpreted when he was talking about that as like when she saw babies with wings in heaven, you might think that those are angels, but they're just humans that have wings. So I didn't know if he was like saying that
Yeah.
what he was seeing was humans with wings because she saw humans.
There's another one. Yeah, he sees a bunch of little winged angels up in a tree. You've read
So
this?
that they're little. I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking of, it's a picture in my mind. I was like, are these, leprechauns or what was he saying? But I just think it was the way, the language he was choosing because back in those times, would he have even had the
How would he know?
knowledge to-
Yeah. Yeah. So I would be magnanimous with the fellow that he was doing his best, but I think God was wise to use someone who had the proper lens to be able to interpret it. Now I'm going to say something controversial. Shall I say?
Yes.
I don't know.
Have any of you seen Elder Dudley's book about?
You knew what you were gonna say.
Did you know this? Okay, the official genealogical tree of Ellen White comes straight from England. But have you seen her?
Now, can I just ask you? Because I wanted to know why you chose that, of all the pictures that you could have chosen this morning. I first wanted to know where you got it from. And number two, why did you choose that? You could have chosen any other picture.
Oh, because I had fun fixing it, but you saw the transformation.
Yes.
I did it. I have two videos on it. If you look, see my channel, I have two videos where I said, and I had to take this scratch out and this, that, and so I just did it in a matter of seconds because I didn't want to waste time. But it was a lot of fun. But it's also, it gives you certain notion of her. Here's where I don't know it for a fact. But I think it would be cool if she had some African American heritage. I think that would be cool, don't you? Some of you feel that would be cool. I mean, she's the church's spiritual mother. It's kind of neat that she would have multi-ethnic background. But officially, and there's a difference between official genealogical trees. My wife found this out. She found out that a grandfather was not a grandfather. Sometimes the heifer jumps the fence. And it's not in the official tree. Genetics don't lie. So she found some stuff out, and anyway, it's not 100%. I don't know if you look at her features, the cheekbones, the nose, the lips. Although the lips, they're like nothing I've seen in anybody. It does not look like any ethnic group that I can exactly link to.
Do you have any pictures of her mother? Because I've seen the pictures of her father. I
No.
studied this for years and I can't find the mother. And
There is no picture that we know of. That's what I mentioned that in the sermon. I wish we did, because that could answer some things. But then again, it might open some cans of worms. Yeah. Her dad is probably the English connection, definitely the English connection. And if you look at all of her siblings, they have different features. And here's the thing that kind of tips it a little bit more for me than just the faint resemblance of some of the features. And are you guys going to put this up on the internet? I don't.
You want me to stop recording?
Yeah, well, that's all right. You can edit it or you can put it up. I don't care. I mean, I go by the weight of evidence. And on her biographical blank, that it's not in her handwriting, but she dictated for somebody to fill in. They asked her what was the color of her complexion. You know what her answer was? Rather dark.
Wow.
And this is not a lady that's been out suntanning, you know? So her complexion, so a lot of the images that we do of her are gentrified, is that the word? Are lightened up in a certain way that she probably had a little darker tone to her complexion. And, you know, she's got 50-50 genetics from her parents. So how much is there? Now, to nail this down, her granddaughter did a genetics test. A maybe third grade granddaughter did a genetics test, and there was no African American in her side. But that doesn't mean a whole lot. My wife has had, you know, certain ethnic backgrounds that she knows in the background, and when it comes down to a grandkid, it disappeared on that branch, so you don't know for sure. And the rest of her siblings, they don't have those same features. There are a lot of pictures of her siblings. Her sister looks a little bit different. So, you know, some of her nose, that's from the accident, you know, the way that it looks. Some of it's from the accident. But the lips, man, that didn't come from, you know, and the cheekbones, that didn't come from the accident. So anyway, yeah. Anyway, so I think it would be cool.
2 comments.
Yeah.
Don't tell me I just forgot. Sylvia, so I'm not a born Seventh-day Adventist.
Right.
But I want to also thank you for sharing because I've learned so much. When I first got here, Sylvia was like a magnet to me. And I had talked to her on the phone rather regularly. But when we first started talking, I asked her and I said, Sylvia, who's Ellen White? Because I didn't know her. And then I was like, is she Black?
Mm.
But then I looked at her hair. But then I thought, well, I'm a Black female who has a white child, literally. But my DNA says that 23andMe says that I'm
How much?
70%, 20% European, and I'm 70% African, you know,
Yeah.
Nigeria, all this. But unless she tells you, we'll probably never know.
Jeff.
Yeah, a couple of things. Just one, I know, again, thank you so much for all of this and what I'm ready to know. If you do need to go and slip out, you know, it's getting well into the afternoon, so you're not going to be looked upon negatively. But I wanted to say one thing, Jack, on the Desert Ford question, and that is just that you look at the way that his issues and the timing of how things came about. And really, I think it was that he reached some other conclusions, such as the gospel salvation worked in a different way, and it's not in the way that we understand the sanctuary pattern, including justification and sanctification. He very much emphasized a legal-only status change of justification, downplayed the experience of sanctification playing into that whole picture. And so then he started to need to find different interpretations. And so then you get into Hebrews and he says, well, he went straight into the most holy place, which is, you know, there's good reason to believe that that's
Grammatically,
yeah,
it's not there.
right. That's a whole nother study, but he needed to have that conclusion because he understood the gospel in more in a way that maybe some other Christians do, but not in the way that we have through the sanctuary lens. And so then once you have that understanding, the dates can't be those dates, because he said Jesus went straight to the most holy place. So then he had to say all those dates were wrong, of course.
So you're thinking it's a domino effect.
I think it's a domino effect, and the real cause started with him having a different view of the gospel that's not an Adventist view. Yeah, right. He had, but it's interesting that even I think all the way through the rest of his life, he still pretty much followed the health message. He kept the Sabbath.
Absolutely.
So he knew, I mean, where did Ellen White get that health message from? You know, if she would, so she's all wrong about the dates, but she happened to have insight about health. You know, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, another naughty subject is the nature of God. And people will often support their views from Ellen White's writings that differs from the general Adventist fundamentals, and will say, you know, this is where she is, until they run into something that they don't buy that she says, and then they get rid of her.
Yeah.
That happens, not everybody, but that does happen sometimes. So I think what it really comes down to is that in every man's mind, their thought process is supreme. So if it makes sense to you, she's good. If it doesn't make sense to you, then she's wrong. And that can be on a number of things. I think there is room to say, I really don't get it. You know, I don't have any better knowledge of this subject. And just because I don't understand it doesn't mean that it's not true. You know, and to cut slack for that. My son and I have talked about miracles. He's never seen a bona fide miracle in his life. So he questioned, I don't know if he still does, but he questioned whether miracles actually happen. You know, and I said, well, I've talked to people who could describe a miracle that happened in their life. And even though it hasn't happened the same way for me, I would assume that they're not making this up. Just because it's beyond my thinking or beyond my experience doesn't mean it's not true. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to pose the question here, and this is just your opinion. Can you have the Seventh-day Adventist movement without Ellen White / anybody, the spirit of prophecy, or the Lord speaking through someone to have that spirit of prophecy? Because what I've seen as I've studied church history, a lot of the leaders, A.D. Jones, others have left or remained Seventh-day Adventists, but just trying to keep their distance from her. So can you really have the movement without the spirit of prophecy or her?
We've got a test case. I mentioned it when I was talking about the Sabbath. There is a denomination that said, let's have Seventh-day Adventism Light without Ellen White. And the name of that was the Church of God Seventh Day. Where have they gone? Who are they? How much progress did they make? And then, as I said, the most ironic statement was one of their leaders, the one who invited me, to said, "We would have been really well if we'd had Ellen White." Yeah, I don't know how it could be possible. And yes, in the church, we have varying degrees of fidelity to what she taught in different ways, from the membership to the leadership. You know, people take, and I had hoped at some point in my life that I would find some really purist people that really, got down and followed it to the nth degree, on dress, on diet, on the righteousness by faith, on education, on our health education, our health system, and all of that sort of thing. And I found occasionally people that get this and are on this, but then there are people that are not on that, and so it's going to be. I think it'll be that way to the end. And I fellowship with all people who we agree on a number of things. And if we are agreeable people, we can still move forward, and God can still use us. Now, is there ever going to come a time that there will be an issue that will be so critical that people will part over that issue? Yeah. Well, that can happen. So each of us has to look very faithfully at what she says and apply it to our lives, not rigidly, but faithfully. There was one guy that we knew that he was so keen on having pure water that he would drink nothing but purified water. He'd never drink, and I think that's great, for him. But there are a lot of circumstances I'm not going to be able to find that, and I don't want to make that a life commandment. And so I can apply that to any number of other things that people would say. When I was in Ethiopia, I was getting a headache from dehydration, and the beverage that they gave me was fermented. They said not, but I got a buzz when I drank it. My headache was better. That was all there was to drink. And I was thankful that they offered it. Yeah. We just need to be patient with one another the best we can. hold up. One guy told me this, and I think it's very valuable. He said, we need to learn how to be liberal conservatives. Which he meant to say, have your standards and don't make everybody else jump to your standards. Let them grow.
Pastor Morgan?
Yes.
Do you think your works will make it to the white estate, especially given the fact that you're doing some original work?
There's a tricky matter with the white estate. Your question is, will it get their approval or something like that?
Like it being included in their app?
Oh, in their app?
Yeah.
There are a lot of good books that aren't in their app. Yeah. But as far as it becoming accepted, I hope it's useful to a lot of people, and I hope it gets good circulation. It's valuable. It's not more valuable than the original book. The original book, you can just read it for its benefit. This just gives you some background and affirms the fact that these are historic developments. They're real, and that God was at work. But when I did my first book on Ellen White, I asked if I could get a blurb from the White Estate, and the leader, who I very much respect, declined. And he said, and then I understood afterwards, and that is this. There are things that they, in the past, might have thought was good and valid, and then it came around that there was something in it that was deficient, and so that it came back on them. So unless they put it through their full process, and it's not going to come with their seal of approval. Tim, you'll see in the acknowledgements, most everybody in that I know in the LG White Estate gets some acknowledgement because they have been invaluable at the book, and so they are very much appreciated, and I think they appreciate the work. Yeah, but it's nice to get affirmation. It's not necessary. All right? That sounds like a good way to finish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank you for the invitation, Jeff. Thank you so much. Jeff, why don't you have our closing prayer?
And thank you so much for coming and spending this hour with us.